Professor Rist, thank you very much for joining us today. So we're just talking about this new book you have, which is a very fascinating roundup, very comprehensive and accessible work about how much we can learn, first of all, about the philosophical and theological roots of the West, and how these have really become forgotten in favour of, seems to be, contemporary thought and reason. I just wondered, how did you come about to write this book? What were the reasons for writing it?
Well, John essentially was saying, I've come to an end, I've got nothing else to write. So I said, oh yes you have, because you have to write a book which is intelligible to the ordinary, at least the ordinary intelligent reader. And I'm going to help you, I said. Right. So that's how it began.
Right. And was it prompted by obviously the situation in the West that we face? Is that something you've been really quite concerned about in terms of this? You talk about the anxiety, that the sort of incoherence of philosophical thought that has prevailed in the West.
Yes, well, I mean, I've been thinking about this because, of course, I've been teaching moral philosophy for a long time. Mm. And I'd noticed when I did a thought experiment, which is mentioned in the book, actually, asking students to pick some 2 or 3 moral themes which they had strong views about, and try and find out why they had strong views about these particular points. It didn't matter what they were, you could pick what you like. And then I pointed out that I thought that in many cases you'd find that the reasons you held strong views on one point were inconsistent with the ones you held on another point. If you think back and try and find this, and I tried this experiment out on a number of students over a number of years, and quite a few of them who did try it admitted that it was true. It did actually work out like that. Well, that's a measure of the fact that you're confused. So then the question arose, why are you confused? And that, of course, is the origin of the book in a way, because they're confused because they think they've got one head, and if they've got one head, they've got a coherent thought. But the head has been fed by all sorts of different and radically opposing ideas which have assembled over time, which means that this result you're completely confused, and you can't defend one view with the arguments used to defend another. It's going to be very widespread indeed, and indeed affect the whole society, because people just don't realise this has happened to them. They're constantly cherry-picking, if you like, bits and pieces from all sorts of contradictory sources, and that means that they're going to be confused, and the result is obviously often quite disastrous, and certainly philosophically utterly incoherent.
Yeah. Yes, and you begin the first chapter, I thought quite fittingly, you talk about education and how that's changed in England and Britain especially, and then moving on to university education. People have say that's become very influenced by sort of cultural Marxism. Would you agree with that? Is that something that you would say contributes to this incoherence that we have now?
Cultural Marxism. Well, it has, but that's, as it were, the tool which might produce the trouble. But what you need to ask yourself behind that is the sheer numbers of people in the system. When we were students, the number of people who went to universities in the UK was about 6% of the population. Now it's probably about 50%. And the result of it in many cases has been that a lot of people are learning or picking up degrees without doing anything in great depth. They think they've had an education, but in many cases it's been a very facile education. They haven't really had to think very hard. And in that situation, when you've got people who think they're better educated than they are, that leaves them open to being manipulated in many cases by ideologically driven enthusiasts of various sorts. And yes, I mean, cultural Marxism, that's a theme which comes in the book. I don't think we use that phrase at all in the book, but it's certainly relevant. People, you'd think about, say, the influence of someone like Antonio Gramsci, for example, who first came to think that in the West there'd be no chance of overturning capitalist society by the standard methods of Marxist-Leninism, physical force and violence. It's not going to work. So the thing is to undermine the system from within. That's the only way to destroy it. And that was developed a bit further with the so-called Frankfurt School, Habermas and the like, talked in this sort of way. And eventually a large number of people who thought they understood society, so to speak, had an opportunity to mislead, I would say, large numbers of semi-educated people, with the result that the confusion was very widespread indeed. I mean, you can see the effects of this at all sorts of levels, but one thing is that the number of people being turned out of high schools now, far more people have turned out and far more people go to university, but the standard at which they enter the university is much, much lower, and it's never really recovered. So that the problem, both not only in the UK, but also in the whole of the West, really, is not what's happening at the university level, but what's happening at the high school level. There, people are getting what they're supposed to be a good education, and it's marked by a certain kind of degree of qualifications, which you mentioned. But the qualifications are often quite worthless. They don't tell you anything about the real standards being taught. So that when you get a lot of half-educated people, so to speak, they're really open to manipulation in a way that the poorer people are not. The people less educated are much less open to this. They have a sort of common sense. And what happens very often in the universities now is that the common sense is destroyed and not replaced by anything particularly specific at all. It's just a series of vague buzzwords and the like, which you pick up and throw about. And you know how to describe people who don't fit the bill, but you don't really have any coherent idea of either what you want yourself to get, or even less so how you're going to manage to get it.
You posed an interesting question. You say, what if our teachers have been asking the wrong questions? Questions
yes,
that were confusingly posed, you say.
Yes, well, I mean, one of the things that had struck me just teaching philosophy generally is that why are we asking these questions? Because some of them don't seem very obvious questions to ask. And so the answer to that, obviously, in one sense, as we say in the book, is that when you start to study philosophy, you think that philosophy is what your teachers do. And so you try and answer their questions. But if their questions are the wrong questions, you won't get very good answers. Whatever answer you give, you may refute them, but it's not going to be very useful philosophically in the longer run. And the same problem will go further back, right back to Adam and Eve, in fact. They may have asked the wrong question too. So in view of that situation, what we recommended in the book was, in some sense, we've got to start again from the beginning and go through it from beginning to end and try and see where the mistakes were made and why. Because often the mistakes were made not really for philosophical reasons. I could give one example of this. I'm not sure if this is in the book or not. But if you read the rather brilliant English writings of Thomas Hobbes, for example, in the 17th century, it's very impressive stuff, and Hobbes in many ways is a very good philosopher. But sometimes you'll come across a sentence and he'll say something and you look at this and you say, there's 1,000 years of philosophy of mind gone down the drain in that one sentence. So the problem with that is not why Hobbes said this, but why he got away with it. And why wasn't he challenged on this particular point? And that's because, of course, he was saying things that people wanted to hear. And they wanted to hear them for reasons that had nothing to do with philosophy at all, but to do with entirely outside influences in the society. We were talking about influences that there were. But yes, it comes down to that. A different set of people were wanting to be made happy by the philosophers than the ones who wanted to be made happy by them 200 years earlier, let's say. So that when Hobbes said what people wanted to say, even if it wasn't very good philosophy, this was cheered on. So that then, of course, the next generation tried to decide, well, was Hobbes right about this or not? So you then have another example of carrying the mistake further with each generation.
I think he did run a certain amount of risk, didn't he?
Well, he did. I mean, it's unclear whether Hobbes is an atheist. I don't think he probably is. I think he has a sort of theory that God started the world off in somewhere or other. In fact, what he claims to say is that the only thing we know about God is that if there is one, he must be omnipotent. But it's not clear whether he really believes in one or not. But it's convenient, certainly, for him to leave it ambiguous because, of course, being an atheist at that point might bring you the death sentence, or certainly some other fairly severe handicap, as it were.
And it's very interesting, I thought, too, you bring in, of course, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and what we can learn from ancient Greek philosophy in terms of how interpreting today's culture and the way people are thinking today. What can we learn from them?
One thing I'd like to say right away, I think that Plato is the best and probably should be the most influential philosopher we've had in the West so far. And one of the things he saw, which is particularly relevant to our contemporary society, is that if you don't accept the existence of a world beyond the world of physical sense perception, space and time, that is a transcendent world, if you don't do that, you can't establish any serious value system at all. So in the words of a recent cardinal, in fact, writing about the same sort of theme, but through a theological lens, his book is called God or Nothing. This is exactly the point that Plato makes better than anybody else in the history of philosophy, that the ultimate alternatives in moral philosophy and in philosophy generally are between the acceptance or non-acceptance of a transcendent reality. Plato calls these things forms, of course, for the good he talks about, but we might say God. Doesn't matter what, as long as it's outside and beyond and superior to, in some sense, the ordinary world in which you live. If you don't have that, then everything else is a human construction, which you can delude yourself has a real philosophical strength backing. For example, Plato was confronted by people in his own day who said things like, well, you've been taught, for example, that you shouldn't beat your father. But why not? What's wrong with that? And, of course, his contemporaries couldn't answer it. They said, well, it's always been like that. So what Plato is saying there, something like, yes, in the old days, before people asked the wrong questions, or the powerful questions in this case, you could get by with a moral world which gave you some sort of control on human behaviour. Not necessarily the best possible, but some possible control on human behaviour. Once you've abandoned that, once you ask these awkward questions, there's no going back. You've got to go on at that point and either defend through some metaphysical claim the possibility of a guarantee, as it were, for morality and for decent behaviour, or we've got to admit that we live in a value-free universe in which ultimately the only reality is power.
That's sort of where we've arrived at now, would you say?
Yes, because, I mean, well, somebody told me the other day, for example, that a friend of his was studying philosophy at Oxford, and he asked his tutor at one point what he thought the job of a philosopher was, and got the answer, primarily to destroy any sense of religion. Really? Now, that's because they want everything to be, in this worldly terms, a matter of calculation, as it were. But, of course, whose calculation is what we've got to ask here. Yes, we're in exactly the position that Plato said we would be in if we had abandoned any transcendent reality. So this is his major claim. He says it better than anybody else has ever done since, and we do well to think about whether he was right.
What's the name of the man at the University of London who thought that Plato was, on the contrary, the cause of all trouble?
Well, yes, many have said that. I mean, Karl Popper.
Popper.
Oh, yes.
Yes, Karl Popper, yes. He wrote a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Book one's called The Spell of Plato. Book two is on Marx and Hegel. But he gets Plato wrong in almost every possible way by reading it very anachronistically. But the book was enormously influential. I mean, that's not the only book of that kind you've got, but it's very easy to misread philosophers in the past if you read them through the anachronistic spectacles of the modern world. Yes. So unless you can avoid doing that, all you've done then is grabbing some person from the past to back up your own prejudices and false beliefs. You haven't really used them to then. So, I mean, people used to say sometimes that if you read, say, a book like Plato's book called The Sophist, it's really a crude example of the modern thoughts of someone like Quine. But of course, if that's true, there's no point in reading Plato. You might as well read Crime, because he does it better. The point is, of course, that Plato does things which might seem peculiar by Quine's standards or by our standards, but he's not a stupid person. So what you need to ask is, why does he say things like that?
Yes.
And then you're beginning to think. Then you can set up his world against your conventional world and ask yourself who's right and who's wrong.
But I suppose it's very difficult today because everyone's used to thinking in a very sort of empiricist way, a scientific way, where everything has to be a materialistic way. So it's difficult to overcome that, would you say?
Yes, well, of course, that kind of what I call scientistic humanism is one of the reasons why the old system collapsed in the 16th, 17th centuries. I mean, people, the successes of science, which involved a different account of what the human mind is, basically, and a different account of what it could think about, that's one of the major causes where we've got into the present position.
You need to explain that you draw a distinction between scientific and scientistic.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes, scientific is simply the activity that science engaging, trying to find out about the world in various ways. But scientistic is to believe that scientists are the priests of a new society, that they can tell you the right answer to everything and solve all the problems that there are. Many scientists, of course, wouldn't like to be labelled scientistic, but unfortunately some are.
Yes.
And they have a huge fame, as it were. People believe them. During the COVID thing, we saw the phrase "follow the science." It's a very misleading phrase. Science often gives you the wrong answers too, even among scientific things.
But this is would you say, a very dangerous trajectory, really?
Well, you believe that scientists can do things which are outside science. Obviously they can do science, but if they shift outside that and start making moral judgments, for example, then they've got no more skill and they're no more necessarily trustworthy than anybody else. But they have this sort of priestly quality about them now. People wouldn't say that, but they have that attitude towards it. They are somehow superior beings in some way in every area of life, not merely their own speciality.
Yes. Now, to get back to the incoherence, do you think this goes back before the Reformation, if you like? Because you speak of a separation in the 12th century of philosophy from theology.
Yes.
And leading to a separation of the link between theology and ethics, and eventually salvation. So do you think the seeds of our current confusion were sown really a long way back, before the Enlightenment and the Reformation?
Yes, I do. I think that the division between philosophy and theology as made in the 12th century, which was really a matter of turf wars, was in one sense a serious mistake. They're not separate disciplines. I would define theology as philosophy plus extra data, basically. Yes. So you have to start with philosophy, then you go to theology. But that's the one point. But then after in the 14th century, which is well before the Reformation, of course, and Renaissance, scientific age, there were confusions in scholasticism, in the dominant philosophy of the day, which pointed to what was going to come later on. Whereas a philosopher like Duns Scotus could say, could there be a moral world if there is no God? Si Deus non durator in Latin. That was a hypothetical question in the 14th century. In the 16th century, since people said there is no God, the question is now, is there a moral world at all? But you can see the beginnings of this. That the origins of this are not, as it were, materialist or anything like that. The origins of this, puzzling enough, are theories about God. These problems arise because of the disputes about the very difficult question of omnipotence. That's why they arise. They arise because if you take the Christian example, there's a biblical phrase which says, everything is possible with God. Well, what does that mean? People began to ask this in the 4th century, actually. For example, they asked, could God change the past, let's say? But But in the 14th century, it became absolutely central in the work of the Franciscans, particularly Scotus and Occam and people like that. They thought that you had to protect God's omnipotence, and that pushed it in the direction that ultimately God could do just anything. There's no logical rules, no sense about it. There's something of this, of course, in the Islamic account of God too, but I don't want to talk about that. If you have that sort of notion, what you're saying is that the moral universe in which we live is simply what God wants, what He wills. It's an act of sheer will. Then, of course, the notion of will gets implanted. It's like a seed, as it were.
But also it's changed its meaning.
Exactly.
Over time.
Yes. But when you get, once God has gone and will remains, what's got left? Yes. Well, the will to power, ultimately.